ওকে, স্টার্ট। প্রিয় দর্শক, আপনাদের শুভেচ্ছা জানাচ্ছি। আজকে আমরা শুরু করতে যাচ্ছি বিপ্লবী ছাত্র যুব আন্দোলনের বিশেষ লাইভ ইন্টারভিউ। আর আজ আমাদের সাথে আছেন উপমহাদেশের অন্যতম মাওবাদী তাত্ত্বিক কমরেড কে মুরালি ওরফে কমরেড অজিত। কমরেড অজিত ছিলেন ভারতের কমিউনিস্ট পার্টি মাওবাদী কেন্দ্রীয় কমিটির সদস্য। আমি যদি একটু তার সম্পর্কে আপনাদেরকে প্রথমে একটু বলি, কমরেড অজিত ছাত্র জীবনে কমিউনিস্ট রাজনীতিতে যুক্ত হন। তিনি তার ইঞ্জিনিয়ারিং শিক্ষাকালীন সময় নকশালবাড়ি আন্দোলন দ্বারা প্রভাবিত হয়েছিলেন। এরপর থেকে টানা মাওবাদী আন্দোলনের সাথে তিনি যুক্ত ছিলেন। কমরেড অজিত মাওবাদী তত্ত্ব এবং রাজনৈতিক অর্থনীতির একজন গবেষক। তিনি 1976 সালে কমরেড মাও সেতুং এর মৃত্যুর পর চীন পুঁজিবাদী পথে হাঁটতে শুরু করলে তখন থেকেই মাওবাদের পতাকাকে ঊর্ধ্বে তুলে ধরেন। আজ আমরা করোনা পরিস্থিতি এবং কমিউনিস্টদের ভূমিকা নিয়ে কথা বলছি কমরেড অজিতের সাথে। আপনাদের কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকলে অবশ্যই কমেন্ট বক্সে সেটা করতে পারেন। Hello, Comrade JP Murali. Thank you for joining us and give your precious time. We are glad to have
Thank you for
appointment.
having me.
Okay, it's an honor to get the chance to ask you questions. Before we start the interview, for the viewer's sake, I would like to present a brief introduction of yours. Viewers, today we have a very special guest with us, Comrade Murali from India. From a diplomat's son, Comrade Ajit became one of the top Maoist leaders in this country. Not only India, he is the top subcontinent Maoist leader. Since his early student days, he has been involved with communist politics. He becomes attracted to the Naxalite movement while he was pursuing his graduation in engineering. He is one of the finest scholar in political economy and Maoist ideology. Today we have the privilege to ask him questions about the corona situation and India. Viewers can add their question in the comment box below. So let's start the interview. Comrade Ajit, first I want to ask right now, what is the situation of the people of India? What role is the state of India playing here?
Well, first, I must thank you for giving me this opportunity to address people in Bangladesh and perhaps many other parts of the world through your organization and this interview that you're doing. And I would just like to add something to that, or rather a correction to that introduction that you did. Doubt very much whether I can be characterized as a topmost ideologue or whatever in the subcontinent. There are far more people who are far more capable than I am. So I have contributed my might, but I don't think it would be proper to exaggerate that beyond what is actually the fact, which is that I'm just one among quite a number of other people who have already passed away, who have already martyred also, and who are still alive. So that's about all as far as that introduction part is there. Now to come to the point that you had raised about the situation of the people in India, you must be reading it in some time to time, at least in the newspapers. Well, actually, just before this interview started, I received a message through WhatsApp giving a partial account of the number of struggles that have taken place in various parts of India, various states of India, and the number of times they have been attacked by the police. Now, almost all of these struggles have been carried out by workers demanding such minimum things like their wages or food or shelter, or protesting against being thrown out of their houses, or demanding that they should be allowed facilities to go back to their homes, villages or wherever they have come from. So this is actually a reflection of what is happening at the bottommost level of society. Because that is where this whole corona thing has created the most disastrous, horrific impact. Like, for example, if you take the state of Maharashtra in India, where the number of corona deaths is very high, highest, in fact, throughout the whole country, and the number of people affected with the disease is also very high. And you come across instances of nurses protesting because they have not been given proper protective gear, of the maximum number of deaths taking place in and around Dharavi and various other slums of Mumbai, because people are living in such crowded conditions in such, it makes no sense to speak about social distance a minute. How do I cut off the calls in between? How do I switch off my calls?
Okay.
Hello, are you hearing me?
Yeah, I hear.
How do I switch off my calls? Now, how do I do that? I don't know. Because somebody might be calling in between again.
You can start. Hear you.
Is there any way I can stop calls, incoming calls altogether? Is there any way that I can stop incoming calls?
No, I don't know actually.
Because somebody might call in between again.
Okay.
Now, that was what happened. Somebody was calling. Anyway, here it goes. Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, I hear.
Okay. I was just thinking of whether I can put this thing on silent mode.
No, start. Okay.
Anyway, let's see what happens. So what I was saying is that this is the condition of Maharashtra, Mumbai, where we have the maximum number of cases, and it's obvious that these maximum number of cases are coming from these slums like Worli, then Govandi, Dharavi, and various other slum areas of Mumbai, where the daily wage workers mostly live. And they live in such overcrowded conditions, in such unhygienic surroundings, with so few public facilities, even toilets and all that. So it's obvious that they are not just going to be able to do any sort of social distancing or anything of that sort. And on the other hand, the type of testing that should be carried out on a massive scale to identify cases beforehand and take measures to see that they are segregated in the whatever ways possible, that is simply not being done. And on top of that, the government is claiming that we are doing everything for the migrant workers. We have started, supplying rations to them and all that, which is simply not true. There are a large number of cases where workers are not being given proper food, where the living conditions are horrible. And above that, when they try to go home, even to the extent of walking thousands and thousands of kilometers, trying to walk thousands of kilometers, they are beaten up by the police, they are arrested, thrown into jail, and all sorts of horrific things are done to them. And in today's papers, there was a news of 14 migrant laborers who had set off from Maharashtra and were walking on the way to some place in Madhya Pradesh. They were run over on the railway track by a goods train. 14 people lost their life, including children. So this shows the whole overall callous attitude of the Indian state, of the Indian government to such a crisis of such gigantic dimensions. It is not that the Indian state does not have the capacity for this, because even while all this is going on, it is able to devote its machinery to suppress the struggle that is going on in Kashmir, carry out launch attacks and murder cadres and leaders of the CPI Maoist, even though they had unilaterally declared a ceasefire, keeping the corona conditions in mind, and launch attacks under the what is a draconian UAPA law, which practically rules out any possibility of somebody getting bail, arresting students and all sorts of activists and human rights activists, etc., from Delhi area, and even Kerala, which is ruled by a so-called communist party, by the CPM, which is a revisionist party. Here too, houses of a journalist and two tutorial college lecturers have been raided under the plea, under the guise that they are all involved in one way or the other with this Maoist movement. And all the electronic equipment, even of people who are not at all associated in any way, who are just staying in that house, that also has been seized at a time when people cannot step out of their houses because of the lockdown. So what I'm saying is that it's not that the state does not have the capacity to handle this problem. If it devotes its resources, manpower and everything, then definitely a lot of things could be done for these basic masses who are suffering because of corona, or in various ways, but that is not being done. What is being done is mainly some window dressing, and the central government is pushing on everything to the state's shoulders instead of taking the responsibility. Do you know the Indian state has sent a naval warship to transport stranded Indians from Mali to India, and they're charging $40 per person. Just imagine, when every country in the world is bringing back its citizens by sending them whatever flights, whatever airplanes, etc. are available, here we have the Indian government sending its own warship. It doesn't have to pay any rent for that, definitely. Sending its warship, and in the meantime, it's trying to make money out of it. And the same thing is true of the flights that it has now started from the Gulf countries to transport Malayalis and other Indian people stranded over there. They also are being heavily charged. So, I mean, it's not that they don't have the resources, it's just that they want to make money. And they want to do it in such a manner. In the case of the trains that were provided for the migrant labor to go back to their home states, in that case also, the railway had initially declared that the money has to be collected from the workers when they have not had any work, no salary for the past 2 months, and yet they are expected to pay up 800 rupees, 600 rupees or whatever to travel back to their home states. And it's only when there was a hue and cry and the Congress immediately tried to capitalize on the situation by announcing that they will pay up, that the Modi government backed down and said that no, only 15%, we will pay 15%, the rest has to be met by the state governments. But the state governments are not in a position to do that because their economy is down. They are not able to raise revenues. And how do you expect them to, and all the expenditure that is coming of tackling this corona is basically on the shoulders of the state governments. So what is really needed is for the central government to take up the burden and push the money. And keep in mind that in between there was a news that came out recently after a lot of effort by the government to hide the fact that 58,000 lakh crore rupees of debt of the big compradors, some 56 compradors or something, have been written off by the banks in India. And most of these banks are government-owned banks. So they are able to do that. They are able to write off all these loans. And in the case of the moratorium that has been declared for the other loan holders, the small families, businessmen, etc., the moratorium is there, but at the same time, the banks are insisting that the interest of this period has to be paid. Now, on the one hand, you say that we are declaring a moratorium because people are not in a position to pay up. And on the other hand, you're demanding that they must pay the interest. So what sense does it make? Especially at a time when you're writing off such a huge amount of money for those who can well afford to pay it. So this is what is actually happening. The condition of the people is very bad. Of course, you'll find some areas, say for example, the state in which I am, Kerala, where conditions are a bit relatively better. But even in Kerala, people have had to come out on the streets to protest. Migrant leaders have had to protest because they were not getting proper food. And even in some Dalit colonies, they have also had to protest because the promised rations they never got. They are facing problems of drinking water and various other things. And the moment they come out on the streets, the police crack down saying that you are violating lockdown regulations. So even in a state like Kerala, where conditions are relatively better, you have these sort of things, and it's basically because the governments are ultimately not really interested in the people. Rather, they are interested in saving their own skins and that of their, the friends, the exploiters of various classes and all that. So this help for the people is a sort of a secondary thing that they have to do to keep up the facade and as also continue that exploitation. So that's what's happening here in India right now.
Okay. We noticed that before coronavirus pandemic, there was a massive anti-fascist mass movement in India. Is India using lockdown to suppress that movement? On the other hand, there are some movement even in the lockdown. In this case, what could be the form of mass movement in the lockdown?
Well, the mass movements have come down, have practically stopped, you can see. That Shaheen Bagh movement was continuing even after the lockdown had started and went on for some more days. But it was obvious that it could not be continued. Now, of course, some new innovative forms of movements have come up. Like, for example, in a place near here, known as Chellanam, which is on the sea coast, and it is under the threat of erosion during the monsoon season and all that. So the people there have been demanding for long, have been on agitation for long, demanding that a sea wall should be properly built and all that. Government has not been doing that. So during the corona time, when the people were forced to wind up their mass struggle and go back to their houses, they continued the struggle from their houses. So that every day, a few families in that area would go on a hunger strike, 24-hour hunger strike, well advertised and publicized on the Facebook and other social media. And other people outside that area also, social activists and well-known intellectuals, etc., they would also join up. And then there was a common day of solidarity where everybody lit a lamp or lit a fire or whatever they could in solidarity. So this struggle is going on. That message is loud and clear that the moment the lockdown is lifted and people are again able to come back on the streets, the struggle is not going to stop. And I think that would be the same thing with that struggle that came up against the CAA and NPR. Because that is a struggle that is going to continue. The fascist BJP government is not going to back off from that move because it is very much part of the RSS agenda. It is very much directed against the Muslim minorities in India, and they will definitely push it and go ahead. So the moment the lockdown is withdrawn, you can be sure that the struggle is going to come up. And in fact, they too know that. And that is why a number of activists who are involved in that struggle have been students and all that have been arrested in Delhi. Even girl student, a young woman who is pregnant. And that too at a time when the Supreme Court has ordered that the maximum amount of prisoners should be released from jail, keeping in mind that the crowded conditions in jails are very conducive for the spread of infection if it affects a jail. So in that condition, these people have arrested that woman who is pregnant and have put her in jail under the UAPA, which means that it's practically impossible for her to get bail in the near future. So it's obviously they're trying to send out a message, that we're going to crack down heavily, and the people are watching it. I don't think that the people are going to back off by these sort of activities, because these arrests have touched off a huge storm of indignation in the social media and whatever forums are now available, where people are protesting and signing petitions and all these things are going on. So it's sure that the moment that people can again step out from their houses and gather in the streets, they will definitely protest. And if the lockdown is for some reason again continuing and the government tries to push these measures in through that, then I'm sure that the people will break that lockdown and come out on the streets. They are not going to back down. That is very clear, because of the determination that was seen in that struggle, the huge participation of women particularly. And I would like to point out another interesting development. For example, here in Kerala, which has a sizable Muslim population, so these struggles, there was a huge participation of women, very militant demonstrations and all these things, particularly in the northern part of Kerala. Interestingly, some religious leaders, Muslim religious leaders, then came out stating that under Islam, the women are not supposed to demonstrate, they are not supposed to raise their hands to shout Inqilab Zindabad and all that. Nobody listened to them. Not a single woman listened to them. Personally, they were committing that mullah can go and do whatever he wants using very vulgar language. I can't repeat that here. But otherwise, they just continued to come out on the streets. They just could not control it. And in fact, that is something that is frightening these fellows, these religious leaders and all that, because they fear that the patriarchal control they had over women might be breaking down in a totally unexpected manner. Because on the one hand, they need these demonstrations because they are also threatened. I mean, they are definitely threatened by this law. But on the other hand, they fear that if this continues, like Shaheen Bagh, etc., spreading all over the country, Muslim women coming out in large numbers, demonstrating and speaking up quite boldly in front of TVs and cameras and all that, that this would lead to a weakening of the patriarchal control. So, I mean, I don't think that the women are going to go back and sit in their houses quietly now, because they very well know what is the threat that is there before them. And the awareness, the conscientization that has taken place, it's not going to disappear. That impact of that is not going to disappear. So we can be sure of that the struggle is going to continue, though it is for the time being, it has been forced to go indoors, so to speak. Okay, that's all.
Okay. Migrant workers are being brought back of different states at the moment. They have come to the streets for the last 2 months and admitted to the harassment. In this case, what is the role of the peoples in the lockdown in India?
Yeah, the migrant laborers have been the worst affected in all senses, you see, because one, when they don't have work, they don't get wages, and it's simply impossible for them to get their absolute necessities of life. I mean, even if the nearby shop owner, somebody who's been knowing them for some time, for years perhaps, there is a limit to which he can give them free supply. And interestingly, even in Kerala, what the government initially did was to call these, the contractors that brought these laborers, call up the house owners where they were staying on rent and tell them that you have to supply food to these people. You have to see that they are staying in the houses and not turned out. Which is practically equivalent to saying that it's your responsibility, we don't know. Because how are these people supposed to sustain them? I mean, a contractor, a small contractor, how many workers for how many months can he sustain with the income that he has, with the savings that he has, if even he's going to dig into savings? Or how much can a shop owner provide rations to the workers? That is exactly why the workers came out on demonstration and protests in a place, a district near here in Kerala, it's known as Kottayam district, Payapad area. Around 3,000 mainly Bengali workers, they came out on the streets demanding that they should give either be sent home, arrangements should be made for that, or they should be given supplies. Now, interestingly, what the police did or the CPM government did was to declare that there is some big conspiracy behind this and arrested one Bengali worker who happens to be a Muslim also. And then they declared that they have searched his mobile phone and found that he has got 3 SIM cards, 4 SIM cards, etc., etc. He's in contact with people from all over India. And the whole media was reporting in such a manner that it seems as if they have caught live a Pakistan agent or something from there, or a Hizbul Mujahideen fellow or something. Well, the fact is that these contractors and their workers, they are always in contact with each other. You see, because they have to bring workers from various areas and they keep on passing on information. What is the work condition? What are the wages? Suppose somebody says that, look, the wages are gone up here. Now you come immediately, then they'll leave their jobs in Mumbai or whatever and run down to Kerala, or they'll shift from Kerala to Bangalore. So this network that they have, mobile phone numbers and SIM cards and all that, it's quite common. There is and everybody knows that. But what I'm saying is that the way the media, the authorities have projected it as if this is some big conspiracy, you know. And interestingly, the first person to go there and investigate this was a human rights activist who has also done some investigation on this various other incidents involving Maoist activists and all that, civil rights violations. So then that was given a spin, saying that there is a Maoist hand in this. So overall, the approach has been sort of threaten these workers, push them down, make them fear that something is going to happen to them. And in a place like Kerala, some minimum rations have been given. Far less than what is really needed, but something has been given. In other states, even that has not been properly done. The number of areas, reports coming of migrant workers starving, literally, because they are not provided proper food, or being fed once a day. And all these things, there are several reports like that. Which is why the workers decided that it's better to start walking back home. You know, I mean, it's no joke to walk thousands and thousands of kilometers in this burning summer, even carrying your small children along with you, babies along with you, with nothing to eat, depending upon a packet of biscuit or a bottle of water and the mercy of whichever village you pass by. So it's not a joke. Everybody knows that it's going to be a really life-threatening situation. Thus, desperately they did it. So you can very well understand what was the condition of the migrant workers. And in many areas, there has been attacks against them. That is also reported. You see. So this has been the overall situation. But of course, there are also incidents where people have stepped in to help them, where people have arranged food for them in Kerala and various other states of the country also. So that has also been there. But on the other hand, the concern and the effort that should have been there on the part of the government, primarily the state government, I mean the central government and then the state governments, was not there, and even now it is not there. You see, here in Kerala, the state government claims that there are nearly 4 lakh migrant laborers in the camps that has been run by them, by this government. Now, out of this, every day, for the past few days, every day they have been sending workers back to their states at the rate of, say, maximum 4,000 per day. So how long is this going to take? And on top of it, they are making fun of these people, in a most despicable manner. They tell them that, okay, you are going to be sent back home today, pack up, let's go. And then they come to the railway station, they are brought to the railway station, and then they are told, sorry, the train has been cancelled. You can go back now. I mean, it's a height of cruelty. You give this expectation and then you do this. And there's another aspect also, that now that the lockdown is slowly being lifted, various state governments are demanding that the workers should not be sent back. Because if the workers go back, migrant laborers go back, then who is going to work in their factories? Who's going to work in their shops? Who's going to do all the dirty work? So they need this labor force. You see, while the labor force was here during the lockdown, starving, lockdown without any facilities, etc., nobody bothered about them. These governments did not bother, these capitalists did not bother. And now, when the lockdown is being lifted and they need this labor force for their work, they are saying that no, don't send them back now, keep them here. We are willing to pay wages. But the workers are refusing. In many places, the workers have refused to stay on, despite being offered high wages and all that. Because they want to go, they've been away from their houses, and the family people are concerned. They want at least to meet them. So they're insisting that we should be sent back. And that is another reason why they are going slow on the sending back people. Because otherwise, if they wanted, they could have, I mean, just imagine, the Indian government lifted thousands and thousands of CRPF and army into Kashmir over a matter of 2 days to suppress the Kashmiri struggle. Is it impossible on the part of the Indian government to make arrangements to send these workers back home? Even if it comes to the lakhs and lakhs, it's not impossible. They have that capacity. They use that capacity to suppress people. They use that capacity to suppress struggles. But when it comes to such basic humanitarian things, they don't do that. And as I mentioned earlier, when they do that, they try to make money out of it also. As what is happening now in this Mali shipment case and all that. So that's about all you can say about this whole situation regarding the migrant labor. Because one thing I should add, the problem they are facing is not just material, in the sense that they didn't have proper food and all that. It's a very sharp and severe psychological problem. Absolutely uncertain about your future, absolutely uncertain about the future of your family. How are things being done there? How are things going? Of course, now, because people have mobile phones and all that, it is possible to communicate and know at least what's going on. But then, that is not much of a comfort. Because lockdown is there everywhere. It's not just only here in this place. It's there all over. And when that income is not there, because they were sending back money every month to their families, when that income is not there, how are they going to maintain themselves? So this concern and all these psychological factors are also created a big impact. And nobody has really made a proper assessment of what is that the psychological scar that is going to live in the minds of these migrant labor, who are majority, vast majority, about 90%, all that youngsters. Married, a number of them are quite, pretty large section of them are married, all right, but very young. Say, I would say between the age range of 15 to 25 or to 30 at the maximum, most of them. So it's not a small thing, this, the psychological impact that this has created is not at all a small thing. And I think that the fallout is going to come in the future. We'll be seeing that soon. Okay.
Okay, Comrade, even in the coronavirus situation, we noticed that Modi was trying to use communism. This attempt was made centering on the Tabligh Jamaat. How do you describe that event?
It was very consciously done. Of course, that thing what they did was idiotic. When such a coronavirus was going on, they should have had the sense to disperse that gathering and avoided it. I mean, but this sort of idiocy, which comes out of fanatic religious faith, is not limited to the Tablighi or any other such Islamic sect. The same thing happened in South Korea, where some Christian pastor carried out a big gathering saying that Christ will save everybody. But unfortunately, Christ was busy with some other business, I suppose, because it created a big spread of the epidemic over there in Korea, South Korea. So the same thing happened here. But it has to be stressed that this was not the isolated event. Here in Kerala, there was a huge gathering at a place in the capital city of the state, in Trivandrum, where thousands and thousands of women gathered for a traditional Hindu event. You know, very well after this whole corona business had started, there was social distancing, etc., had already come into practice, though the lockdown as such had not started. And there were repeated calls by the government and various other people to avoid this as much as possible. But that was not made into an issue by the RSS, by these Brahminical fascist forces. Similarly, there was an incident where the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, Yogi Adityanath, he had participated in a religious ceremony along with hundreds of people. And now, interestingly, that was reported by an online journal, The Wire, and the editor of that journal has now been served someone saying that yes, creating communal disharmony by exposing this thing. You have the Chief Minister of a state violating social distancing rules and understanding and participating in this sort of thing, and he gets scot-free. And a journalist who's doing his duty by exposing this, he is threatened with, not threatened, he's actually been served this thing for a case. He was asked to report in UP. He's stationed in Delhi. He was asked to report in UP to answer the summons. Somehow he managed to avoid that by approaching the higher courts. So in that instance also, nobody said that this gathering of the Hindu fanatics over there has caused a spread of corona or could cause a spread of corona. One does not know what actually happened after that. Because in this case, it is not only that they consciously picked up on this, but they did it in such a manner precisely to hide, to cover up their own incompetence. You see, just before this Tablighi thing came out, the whole narrative, the whole discussions that were going on was about how the government is failing to handle the situation properly. How it has been very late in reacting. Central government has been late in reacting to the situation, and how it is not properly addressing the matter. All these things are the main topics of discussion. Now all that was conveniently pushed aside, and this Tablighi business was made the major thing, and it is even projected as if the whole meeting was convened in that Nizamuddin area, and the people who had attended in that meeting spread out very consciously to spread corona all over the country. Now the interesting thing is that,
one question from Facebook. After corona situation, what will be political control over people in India?
Well, political control, I don't know what you can say about political control, because in my evaluation, the government is sharply exposed for its incompetence, its communalism, and also its assertion of the federal powers and all these things, radical, severe centralization, all that which is trying to do. So I don't think that it will have much of a political leverage after the corona epidemic is over. But as far as otherwise control is concerned, you can be sure that it will be using all these things that it is being put in place now. For example, it has brought out an app known as the Arogya Setu, which is supposed to help people identify whether there is a corona patient near you and take precautions and all that. But the fact is that this app actually gathers all sorts of information about the person who has downloaded it. And that information is now being hacked. It's easily, it's handed over to private companies. And somebody in France has now proved that it can easily be hacked and that this information can be taken by anybody. So, but that's not the concern of the government. The point of the government is that it gets a tool for surveillance. And all these various surveillance methods that have been applied during the corona period, like for example, using drones and all these things, they will definitely be applied in a larger way to tackle and suppress struggles that are coming up. I mean, the surveillance aspect, that will remain. And that is going to be a major issue of struggle in the future. But I doubt whether they will be having any, capacity as far as the political control is concerned.
Okay, another question.
Okay.
Okay, okay, I think public question we try later. Let's take a look at the outside world. Trump is talking about herd immunity by putting people to face death. Is it science-based? What do you think?
Well, there is a certain science, all right, because every epidemic ultimately dies out when the virus has no more fresh population to infect. Because when the virus spreads, it does not infect everybody in the same way. A lot of people develop resistance to it. So you have a population which has developed resistance, you have a population that has been infected, cats has the disease and then survives, developing resistance to it. So in this manner, you ultimately have a situation where there is no more people where the virus can infect. And then for the time being, the virus goes out of activity. So that's how epidemics usually end. Now, the point is, that is one, I mean, that's one aspect, but to think that, okay, so let people die, no matter, let's say a lakh or two die, and then we'll have the toleration will develop and all that. That's sheer, what do you say? It's nonsense and it is inhuman. Is Trump willing to risk himself? If he's so confident that we'll have this hard control and all that, is he willing to risk himself? Or are these people who are around him willing to risk themselves for that? You have doctors and nurses and all these medical staff in countries, even like countries like America, who are in the front lines and working without proper protective gear. There was an incident today reported in the press today of a nurse, I think the secretary or president of a nurses union organization, who mentioned the statement that she is yet to see this PPE, this protective suits that has been talked about. And Trump says that's true for only you. She is the leader of a union. She knows what's happening all over the country because people will be reporting to her. And there are already so many instances where nurses and doctors have declared that they don't have sufficient protective gear. So instead of trying to provide that, ensure that people have the necessary protective gear and ensure that at least the people are in danger. And who are the people who are dying of mostly in America? It's mostly people from the African American background or Hispanics, that is Spanish speaking people, or poor white people, elderly people who are there in the nursing homes, who don't have other people to look after them, or the most, the vulnerable sections of the population. And if you take this attitude, okay, let us, a few of them, thousands or lakhs of them die, and then the rest of us will develop an immunity, that fellow deserves to be, I don't know, it's not proper to say what he deserves to be done right on this video. I might get involved in a case or something for that. I mean, it's a height of inhumanity.
Okay. They're talking about the discovery of the coronavirus vaccine, also some drugs to deal with. It is seen that the global health system has been made profit-oriented. Tell us about the imperialist profit-oriented medical and drug system.
Well, I really don't know much about this. It's quite clear that whenever an epidemic of this sort takes place, and the pharmaceutical companies will be looking at it from the angle of their profits, no doubt about it. I mean, how can we make money out of it? Whether it is vaccine or medicine or whatever. So that is a inevitable part of this whole social system, where the maximum and the principal thing is making money. Profit is the main motive. But whether this is a matter of medicines or is it a matter of vaccination, I saw an opinion on the internet recently, an interview in which a well-known bioengineer, doctorate, PhD doctorate in America, he was arguing that the pharmaceutical industries are now not so much into the business of developing new drugs, because the expenditure that they need to develop new molecules is simply not realizable by the profit that they make ultimately out of selling these medicines after a fairly long delay by the time it takes for the research and all that. So they are shifting their attention more to vaccines. So in that sense, there is an interesting thing that last year, perhaps the year before that, it seems there was a big meeting at Davos, where this World Economic Forum is held every year, in which all the leading pharmaceutical companies and this Bill Gates Foundation fellow, Bill Gates, etc., all of them were gathered along with the heads of states of various countries. And the main topic of discussion was precisely the possibility of the outbreak of such a pandemic and the measures that could be taken in its wake. So obviously, they were not just having that meeting to prepare to face up to this thing, to see that the people suffer the least. Because if they had made such a preparation, you can be sure that these thousands would not have died in these countries. I mean, look at the amount, the number of people are dying. It's not a few hundreds, it's in 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 1 lakh, and so on. And that in very developed countries. If it happens in a country like India or Bangladesh or some of the third world countries, you can still, okay, they don't have the facility. To some extent, you can give that excuse. It's a fact that they don't have that facility, and the population number is so high that it's not easy to cater to the needs of all people. But in a country like countries or European countries, which have a very small population, on the one hand, and are quite developed, have all these facilities, even then you see these people dying in such large numbers. It's very clear that this Davos meeting was not about helping people to face up to this epidemic. Rather, it was how to make money out of this epidemic. And what form that is going to take, whether it's going to be in the form of a vaccine or in the form of medicines, it's yet to be seen. But you can be sure that they are keen on making money.
Okay. Before the coronavirus, the China-US conflict was intensifying, but in coronavirus situation, it has increased dramatically. What could be the global impact of the conflict? The liberal bourgeois are talking about establishing peace in the post-coronavirus world. The question is that, is it possible in this system?
Excuse me, liberal bourgeoisie talking about what? Liberal bourgeoisie is talking
about
peace.
Peace in the
Okay.
post-coronavirus
Well,
world.
I mean, they are not going to go to war. I don't think that they're going to war anyway, not soon. They might have plans in the long term, but right now, that's not going to happen. But the reason, I think there are two reasons. One,
Yeah.
Another call has come. Sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry for the interpretation.
Okay.
Interpretation.
Okay, start.
Uh, so, so what I was saying is that the reason why it is aggravated in the present period, I think, is that one, China seems to be in a better position to utilize the what you say, the post-corona situation, the corona as well as post-corona situation, because it has managed to come out, at least according to the accounts that are coming out. We don't know whether that's the real truth or not, but it has seems to have managed to come out of that epidemic crisis, because it was the first country to be affected and they had managed to come out of it. So definitely they will be able to build up their economy and get their economy going back to full gear in a relatively shorter period, while countries like America and all these are still yet in the crest of the crisis. They have not even reached that point, perhaps. And I think that's one reason why Trump is so much hasty to open up. Even if it means that people are going to die, he's not bothered about that, because otherwise he, as well as the monopoly capitalist, the finance capitalists of America, think that they'll be pushed behind very much if they don't get back into business right now. That's one thing. The second thing is also the electoral factor, because Trump is going to face an election soon, and his claim till recent was that he has succeeded in turning around the economy. Now that has just been blown to smithereens. I mean, there is no recovery or anything near sight anywhere. Economy has gone down and is even going to go further down. Unemployment has shot up like anything. You can be sure that there will be a huge number of bankruptcies after this, during this period, and as well as after the lockdown is lifted over there. So the economy is in a totally bad shape, and Trump cannot claim anything that he has done something which has revived the economy now. And in fact, there is also the recognition that he handled this thing in a very clumsy manner, incompetent manner. He refused to listen to proper advice from people who are knowledgeable, and even he's repeating that even now also. And therefore, that he is partially responsible for the huge stall this corona is taking in America. So then what remains for him in this coming election? And I think that if he is trying to pin this whole thing on China, by claiming that China is responsible for this whole thing, China has done something, and it's because of China that we are now in a bad situation. And therefore, I am the guy who stood up against China, and therefore, you should vote me back to power. Now here, I think there is a factor which has to be analyzed properly. How do we understand Trump's attempt to become friendly with the Russian imperialism as much as possible, and push back against Chinese imperialism, Chinese social imperialism? It's possible that he sees that there is a possibility of driving a wedge between China and Russia, and separating China so that it will be easier for the US to tackle it. Perhaps this is the idea, and that is why he is getting support from a significant section of the American ruling classes. It's not, despite all of his idiocies and his cranky behavior, madness, etc., he's still being supported by a significant section of the American ruling classes. So one has to think why. Of course, one aspect is that he's fully in favor of this whole neoliberal agenda. That's true. But apart from that, I think this factor also might be there. So this contradiction is going to sharpen in the coming period. The corona has aggravated it. It's going to sharpen even more. But I don't think that you're going to have a war or anything in the near future. That's all.
Okay. Modi had ordered to stop the export of hydrochloroquine, I think. Trump then issued a warning, and Modi reversed his decision within 24 hours. This is not our main question. Many of our friends and social democrats here think that India is an imperial country. But in that case of medicine, it was proved wrong. Could you please explain it was proved wrong?
Well, forget America, Trump's threatening and all that. There was another incident recently, all this Islamophobia and this Tablighi business, etc., etc. And that was taken to heights in the recent period. You had the organizer, that is the organ of the RSS itself, directly doing this propaganda. And RSS supporters of this Brahmin fascist organization residing in the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE and all that, they started putting out posts of a very rabid communal type, and it became so much of an issue that ultimately ruling circles of the UAE, some princess of the UAE, she was forced to come out with a social media post condemning this and saying that we will take severe action. This will not go unpunished and we will take severe action. And action was taken. A number of this RSS fellows have lost their jobs in these Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and all that, and they are under threat of being arrested and put in jail also. So what would you expect this big India superpower, etc., claims to be the second economy and all in the world and all that, which is being made by these idiots? They just clamped down. You had these RSS guys, one after the other, writing in the newspapers saying that no, nothing of that sort. That is not our policy. India, that has never been India's policy, and that has never been the RSS policy. You had the BJP president even taking action against an MLA who did something in a very communal manner. He told his supporters, voters, not to buy stuff from Muslim grocery shops, saying that there is a report that they are spitting on the vegetables to spread corona. Look at the idiocy of that. If this guy who's spitting to spread corona, then he must have corona, the guy who's spitting it. And if he's there alive without any problem, he's able to do the spitting day after day after day after. And then you say that he's still spreading this corona. Anyway, leave out that idiocy. What I'm pointing out is that all this blatant communal propaganda was done. You had some princes in UAE and some people in Saudi Arabia and all that taking action against some of those postings in the social media. And the next thing you see is that the BJP president, the RSS leaders like Ram Madhav and all that coming out in the newspapers saying that this is not our policy and this is not the culture of India, etc., and giving justification saying that this won't happen. So what I'm saying is that what was the real thing? That they got shit scared because the money has to come from there. All these claims about India being the second biggest economy and all these things, it's depending upon the capacity to export goods to foreign countries and to get all the necessary resources from foreign countries, like crucial resources like oil and all that. So it's very clear that when Trump rolled his eyes, Modi had to bend his knees. It's as simple as that. It's not a new thing. It has happened in the past also. For example, if you look at the period of the 1971 liberation struggle in Bangladesh, when the Indira Gandhi government intervened in that liberation struggle and very consciously used it to suppress the leftist forces and put up their own people there. And the Americans sent in the 7th Fleet, but Indira Gandhi's government did not buckle down. It was presented in India as a mighty, showing the strength and the guts of the Indian government. The fact is that they were being supported by the Soviet imperialism at that time. They had an Indo-Soviet friendship treaty. And in fact, if Soviet planes were not landing every day in Dum Dum airport with their ammunition and shells and whatever was required by the Indian army, the Indian army would not have simply been able to proceed in that war. So this is an old thing. It's not a new thing at all. That in fact, India is as much a third world country as any other third world country. True, it is a far bigger economy. And in South Asia, it is an expansionist power. And the Indian comprador, bureaucrat, bourgeoisie, and all that is compared to other third world countries quite powerful compared to other third world countries. But when you put the comparison in terms of India versus other imperialist countries, it's a oppressed country like any other. It's a third world country. So there is no question of India being an imperialist power in any way.
Okay. We noticed, and your recent statement has also said that imperialism is said to have made huge development, but they have done nothing for the basic rights of the people. The coronavirus embedded it. How does socialism deal with such a situation?
No, when I said that about development, what I was saying is that these countries are considered to be developed countries. In general terminology, these countries in the West are, imperialist countries are characterized as developed countries in the sense that they're advanced capitalist countries. When you compare them with countries like India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Burma, and all that, who are third world countries, oppressed countries, otherwise also characterized as developing countries. So it was in that sense, there was no question that they have developed in the sense of giving the basic necessities to the masses. I mean, there is a huge amount of poor people in America. The only thing is that the standards of poverty are different. For example, as far as I know, the number of people who are living on the roads in the streets in America is quite huge. There are a huge number of people who are lying on the streets, and in the night they go to some shelter or they take shelter in the metro stations or whatever. And there is another huge number of people who simply live out of their cars. They all their belongings are there in their car. They get up in the morning, go to some public comfort station, to their toilet and all whatever is there, dress, and then drive off to their jobs. And after doing all that, in the nights they come back and stay in that car only. And there are people who are forced to share rooms with other people because they can't afford to. There are people who don't get married because they can't afford to rent a house to start a family. So conditions are quite bad. It's not that it's good for the masses, broad masses as such. But it's an advanced capitalist country, so the standards are different there. That's what I was trying to mean. And pointing out the contrast that despite being so advanced and developed and all that, these countries are not able to provide the basic minimum healthcare facilities for their people. That was what I was trying to bring out, that contrast, the contradiction there. You see, the point is, it is true. There is a debate here going on in Kerala now. For example, there is a ex-Maoist leader by name of K. Venu. He was our leader at one time. A number of the old Maoists in Bangladesh would have heard about him, or some might have even met him personally. Now the guy has betrayed the movement and betrayed the people, and he's a pakka apologist of the ruling classes. So he has been saying that whether it is capitalism or socialism, it just makes no difference. Epidemics can happen anywhere, and all that. That's his basic argument that he's saying. It's also genetic and all that. It's true. There is nothing to say that in socialism a virus will not spread. Yeah. But one thing, the chances of that happening in socialism can be considerably reduced. Because as I pointed out in that article, basing myself on an article which came in the monthly review, one major reason for the spread of these viruses is the way deforestation is taking place. And deforestation is taking place at such a huge pace precisely because of the pressure of capital. It's a profit-seeking motive. So you remove that from the picture, then definitely in a socialist society, you definitely don't have that necessity. Rather, you would think of how to restore the degraded environment. Particularly now, I think that any socialist movement definitely have a very critical component of environmental thinking with it, giving the understanding, the new awareness that is available on these issues. It was already there in Marxism, but now we can have a more all-rounded and a deeper understanding. So definitely in socialism, the chances of such a virus spreading out are less. Second, if it does happen, then definitely the effort of the socialist government, the state, to contain that virus and to take care of the masses would be of a totally different dimension, because it's basically that socialist government is something that serves the people. It is not driven by the profit motive. You see. So because of that, since its ultimate thing is, its main motto is that of serving the people, it will go all out, use all of its capacities to see that this epidemic does not cause havoc. It does not destroy more than what is inevitable, in the sense that you can try your best to control it. And this has happened in the past also. It's not the first time that such things have happened. Of course, not necessarily a epidemic like a virus attack or anything, but say cases of flood, cases of heavy typhoons and all these things that have taken place in these socialist countries, China, Vietnam and all that. How did they face that? They threw all their capacities into it. The whole army was mobilized, all the youth organizations, students organizations, all the masses, everything was mobilized to take up, fight against that, to save the people. So that is the difference between a capitalist government and a socialist government. And definitely there will be a difference. There is no doubt that this huge amount of deaths that are taking place in the Western countries is precisely because of this whole capitalist profit motive. Now, within that, you can see differences. For example, New Zealand is there. Then there is an example that is now quoted of Taiwan. I don't know much about that because not much of information is coming. There is the case of South Korea, where they carried out massive testing and they were able to control the disease. So there are differences within that, which perhaps depend upon some social democratic background and all that. I don't know. More probing is required. But evidently, you see, for example, in Italy, as I mentioned in an earlier interview, there were reports being sent by Malayali nurses who are working there of how people are being left to die, literally left to die, or given up to die, not left to die, given up to die by removing the ventilators. When a doctor says that this person is old, he is not going to recover, okay, we'll stop treating him, then they pull out the ventilator and put it for some other patient. Very well knowing that the moment they remove it, the guy is going to die in 10 minutes or something. Why? Because they don't have that equipment in the numbers that are required. And why did that happen? Because the government did not take the efforts to prepare for that. And it's not that they didn't have time. They had the time, but they didn't prepare. Okay.
It is seen that the surveillance of the people is being increased using the coronavirus. States are taking a terrible fascist stance. States around the world are controlling people through technology. In this case, will there be any change in the state policy, the post-coronavirus situation?
Yeah, definitely. They are using this to, test and perfect their surveillance apparatus. You see, and you can be sure that after the corona epidemic is over, then this surveillance apparatus and all that will be continued to be used against the people. There's no doubt about it. Drones, all these apps, this information that they have collected about people, everything of it. On the one hand for surveillance, and on the other hand for data mining, to sell the data to private concerns. So that is definitely going to happen. In fact, I would say that perhaps one of the major demands that could be raised by mass movements after this corona epidemic is over is the scrapping of all this data that has been collected by the governments. Demanding that this data should be destroyed. that could be a major point of mobilization and rallying in the period after Corona.
Okay, it is being said automatically will be predominant in the post-coronavirus world. In that case, what kind of change can happen in the world? How can we deal with it?
What kind of change? In what sense are you meaning that? When you say what kind of change, in what sense do you mean that?
Post-corona predominant in the post-coronavirus.
Well, one thing is that the economy, the world economy is already in a bad shape. It is going to be a worse shape. Actually, it's not that the corona crisis epidemic has triggered off an economic crisis. The recession was already there. Everything was slowing down. Growth was going down. This was already in place before corona, and corona has aggravated it and made it a very severe thing. So this is going to continue for some time. One thing. The second thing is that, as I said earlier, the various surveillance methods that have been applied by the governments all over the world, they are going to continue to use that. They're going to continue to use these methods to tighten control over people. For example, in India, you have the situation where one after the other, the state governments are now making changes in labor laws. As you know, in India, according to, I suppose in Bangladesh also should be the same thing. The ordinary working day is 8 hours. And after that, you're supposed to be given overtime. Now, a few state governments in India, ruled by the BJP as well as by the Congress, they have decided that the normal working hour will be expanded to 12 hours to make up for those losses of the corona. So practically half a day, the worker will have to work half a day. Now, some people are saying that, okay, that extra 4 hours will be considered overtime. Though it is not voluntary overtime, it will be compulsory overtime. But whether that will actually be counted as overtime or whether it will be counted as part of the normal working day, that is still not clear. Labor laws that are normally applicable, it has been decided that they will all be suspended. In the case of MP, I think they have decided that it will be suspended for one whole month. So in other words, the corona and the economic slowdown is being used as an excuse for launching an assault on workers, for pushing reforms, which has been there in the agenda of the ruling classes of India for long, right from the UAPA governments, Manmohan Singh governments onwards, they have been talking about reforming the labor laws. So now they want to use this crisis precisely to carry it out by giving this excuse that the economy is down and unless we run the factories for longer periods and all these things, we cannot make up. So using this as an excuse, they're pushing these reforms. So this sort of activity you can expect in all countries of the world. The ruling classes will try to push forward measures that they've been planning for a long time, trying to utilize this whole context of the atmosphere of the crisis, I mean the corona epidemic situation. On the other hand, as far as the masses are concerned, I think the most important thing is that this is exposed like never before the real nature of this whole world system, that how fragile this whole claim of big development, advances, that and all that has been made. The whole claim about globalization, how it has helped push the world into a totally new direction, all that, how all that is so fragile, and that these governments are incapable of actually dealing with this sort of a situation. And also that this whole talk about privatization as the only way out, the bankruptcy of that thing, of the whole GPL program, that is the globalization, privatization, liberalization program, bankruptcy of that, this is now more and more aware among the people. Like say, for example, you might have noticed on the TV that when the British Prime Minister as well as his co-ministers would come out to give press conferences to tell the people about the corona situation, the rostrum behind which they were standing had a placard saying protect the NHS. NHS is the National Health Scheme. It is the
True.
Universal Health Scheme in Britain. Now this Conservatives, of which this Boris Johnson is a part of it, this Conservative Party has been demanding that the NHS should be dismantled for long. It's a waste of resources, it's a waste of effort, and the people will be much better off if its whole thing is privatized and not there people are left to decide which doctor to go and where. But when the crisis epidemic struck them, they have boards saying protect the NHS. And the British government has renationalized 2 railway services. Spain renationalized all the private hospitals. Of course, they might hand it back after this whole thing is over. But what I'm saying is that this is really sharply exposing all these claims of privatization being the panacea and the way out of the way forward for the world economy. So this is being seen by the people. They see how the governments are incompetent. They see, for example, in a country like India, they see how the ruling classes, the fascist government is trying to utilize this whole thing for pushing its communal agenda rather than serving the people, caring for the people. They see how the migrant labor have been left to their fate without any concern for their health and safety and all that thing. So overall, there has been an exposure of the system, of the rulers and of the ruling classes of the state. This is definitely going to create an opportunity for the genuine forces on the side of the people, particularly the genuine communists, to aggressively push their agenda, to propagate how communism is different from this mess that has been going on for long, and how that is the only way we can get out of this mess. So there is a very bright opportunity for that is coming up. And of course, it depends to what extent that is imaginatively seized upon. Because it is also true that there is a huge amount of youngsters, young youth out there who are interested in changing the system, but are not confident or quite sure that communism is actually the way forward. Because they have this understanding that this sort of thing has failed all over the world and it's dictatorial, etc., and all that. So there is a task before the genuine communist forces of going among them and doing the propaganda in an imaginative, innovative manner that really brings the lessons of communism to them. Like, for example, propagating how in countries like China during the socialist period, that is during the Maoist period, there was a universal health arrangements, a system in place which looked after the people of whatever age group and whichever sectors they were, and various other things like that. That what were actually the results of socialism, of the real socialism that had existed here in those days. So this opportunity is definitely going to come up, because the actual thing is going to come up after the lockdowns are lifted. And when the people again are able to come out on the streets and gather, that is when then the real issues will come up, when the real opportunities will come up. And it depends very much on how ready the genuine communist forces are on to seize this opportunity.
Okay. This is last question from me. Overall, the coronavirus has proved that the imperialist world is in crisis. In that case, do you think is there any possibility of revolution in the post-coronavirus situation?
Well, revolution is always a possibility, not just in this. You see, revolutions, if you look in the past, outbursts, not necessarily revolution leading to a seizure of power, but outbursts of the masses have taken place on totally unexpected manner. It has never followed a direct pattern. And I think there is some place where Lenin himself points it out that is not how things happen. That they just break out of the blue. Somehow that it just starts. The question is whether that sort of an opportunity, if it comes up, will it be utilized, or can it be utilized by the genuine revolutionary forces or the genuine communist forces to carry out an actual revolutionary seizure of power? Now, in that regard, I think the potential, the possibilities are a bit rather low nowadays. If you look at the situation of the subjective forces around the world, the opportunity perhaps in a country like Philippines, where as far as I know the party and the armed forces are more spread out and well developed, comparatively better developed, there might be an opportunity there, because there have been mass upsurges in that country earlier also. But I don't think that prospect is something that's going to immediately come up here in India, though there will be definitely large good opportunities for the revolutionary forces to expand in a significant manner. That is definitely there.
Okay, thanks to join us, comrade. And আমরা চেষ্টা করব সময় স্বল্পতার জন্য অনেক প্রশ্নই আমরা আজকে গ্রহণ করতে পারিনি, চেষ্টা করব এগুলোর উত্তর আমরা পরবর্তী আরেকটি পর্বে দেওয়ার জন্য, এবং পুরো ইন্টারভিউটা আমরা বাংলাতে অনুবাদ করে খুব শীঘ্রই পেজে আপলোড করা হবে। যারা এতক্ষণ আমাদের সঙ্গে ছিলেন তাদেরকে অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ, and thanks comrade. And now
thank you for hosting me and giving me this opportunity, and Lal Salam to all your viewers.
Lal Salam.
So